Afternoon, everybody, or maybe morning or evening, depending on where you are. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andrea Carlise, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Action Network for Gender Equity and Law, or IANGEL. Welcome to IANGEL's CSW parallel event, Advancing Climate Justice Through Feminist Leadership. Before we hear from our panel of climate justice experts, I'd like to tell you a bit about our organization. IANGEL's mission is to use our international network of lawyers and activists to advance gender equity and protect the human and civil rights of women and girls. We advance our mission by connecting the lawyers and legal associations willing to donate their skills and energy to the activists and organizations working to promote gender equity nationally and throughout the world. IANGEL supports and collaborates with individuals and organizations working to protect and advance women's rights, to confront gender bias, and to reform legal and cultural barriers to the full and equal protection of women in society. We believe that connecting volunteer lawyers to the cause of gender equity will build a stronger movement for justice worldwide. And most importantly, IANGEL believes in a world where all people have the same rights to basic human dignity, fairness, and self-determination. And we see how right now worldwide, all of those things are being challenged. IANGEL executes our mission through education, advocacy, and pro bono engagement in our three focus areas of reproductive justice, peace and security, and women and girls empowerment. In the area of sexual and reproductive health and rights, we're currently finalizing our Teen Information Project for Reproductive Justice, a curriculum to teach middle and high school age students about their legal rights relating to reproduction, which, as we know, are very precarious at the moment in the US. Partnering with the Alameda County District Attorney's Office here in California, we are the subrecipient of a grant to provide wraparound services to minor survivors of human trafficking, and we're training lawyers to provide pro bono legal services. We're also working on finalizing reports for our Girls' Rights Project, which analyzes human rights issues related to reproductive justice, child marriage, and female genital mutilation in 3 global regions from both a domestic and international perspective. Our current advocacy work includes joining amicus briefs supporting the right to abortion and supporting survivors of sexual assault and trauma, as well as endorsing legislation like the Girls Lead, or Leadership Empowerment Agency and Development Act, to increase girls' participation in the decision-making processes affecting their lives and communities in order to foster new generations of empowered women leaders. Each year, IANGEL awards its Amel Zanouni Zawani Rights and Leadership Award to honor exemplary leaders promoting women's rights and gender equality. In 2018, this award was named for Amel Zanouni Zawani, an Algerian law student who was murdered by fundamentalists for refusing to give up her studies. We are currently accepting nominations for the award, and you can find more information about it on our website at iangel.org. We'll also provide more information in a follow-up email. So enough about IANGEL, switching gears now to this event, where the discussion will focus on the intersection of climate and gender justice. As with all issues that are negatively affecting humanity, climate change has a disproportionate impact on women who generally have fewer rights and more responsibilities for feeding and raising families. Our panel of experts will discuss how, by recognizing and valuing the contributions of women, particularly women of color and in indigenous communities, we can make progress in our quest to combat climate injustice. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for today's panel, Natalia Orzolo Gutierrez. You can find full bios on our event page in the NGO CSW 66 virtual forum platform. That's a mouthful. And Joelle Santos, IANGEL's Communications and Development Officer, who's helping out with the technical aspects of this webinar, will also drop a link in the chat. Natalia is a Colombian lawyer specializing in environmental law and policy. After completing her legal education in Colombia, Natalia received her second LLM from UC Berkeley, where she earned the opportunity to serve as a Koblenz Fellow with the Othering and Belonging Institute. Natalia's dissertation provides an analysis on whether the recognition of the rights of nature could serve as a path towards an effective environmental peace-building process in Colombia. Natalia also served as a legal intern for IANGEL, and we are now so fortunate to have her serving as a director on our board of directors. Natalia will introduce you now to our esteemed panel. Natalia?
Thank you, Andrea. And a warm welcome to all of you who have joined today to hear the amazing presentations from these outstanding panelists. This session will last about 90 minutes. The panel will take approximately 80 minutes, and if we have time, we will have like 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. So please type in your questions in the chat box, and we will later read them to the panelists. And if you want to direct the question to someone in particular, please do mention that in your question. Now let me introduce you to today's panelists. Eileen Wakesho is a land and property rights practitioner with keen interest on women's land rights. She currently serves as NAMADI's advisor for the Community Land Protection Program, a program that seeks to strengthen land tenure rights for indigenous communities. Eileen previously served as Oxfam International Women's Lands Rights Advisor, has worked with Kenya Land Alliance, Development Policy Management Forum, and Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis, focusing on women land rights, land governance, and land and conflicts. Rebecca Iwerks supports land and environmental justice warriors as the learning and policy advisor for the Global Environmental Justice Corps at NAMADI. Before joining NAMADI, Rebecca fostered movements for change and capacity development on access to justice issues ranging from natural resource revenue management to land tenure. Rebecca also has roots advocating for gender justice, drawing from experience directly representing survivors of trafficking and gender-based violence in New York. Her career began working alongside the Burmese democracy movement in Thailand and India. Alison Torbit is in the Energy and Environmental Practice Group at Nixon Peabody and is also active in maritime matters. She focuses on environmental transactional due diligence and compliance and renewable energy, counseling a large range of manufacturers, developers, and financing parties to find solutions, mitigate, and allocate risks associated with all aspects of environmental laws. Alison counsels business and industry clients on compliance with federal, state, and local environmental and energy laws, as well as defending against regulatory enforcement and third-party disputes. Alison is also co-leader of the firm's Legally Green initiative and co-leader of the Food, Beverage, and Agribusiness team, thinking strategically about sustainability and the risks that clients face due to climate change, aging infrastructure, and the need for innovation and to stay ahead of these challenges. Maria Antonia Tigre is the Global Climate Litigation Fellow at the Sabin Center. Prior to joining the Sabin Center, she was a senior attorney at the Environment Program of the Cyrus R. Vance Center for International Justice, where she provided pro bono legal services to NGOs across the globe, especially in issues related to protected areas and the interface between human rights and the environment. Maria Antonia was previously a fellow at the World Resource Institute. The fellowship followed several years working in private practice in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Maria Antonia serves as the Deputy Director of the Global Network for Human Rights and the Environment, GNHRE, where she works with scholars and practitioners in the region to study the interface between human rights and the environment. In addition, Maria Antonia is a member of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. And finally, Dina Lupin is the director of the GNHRE. She is a lecturer at the University of Southampton. Previously, she was a researcher in the project Giving Groups a Proper Say, supported by the Austrian Science Fund and hosted at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Vienna. Dina is also a consultant specializing in environmental law, indigenous peoples' rights, gender, and legal theory. Dina's current research is on silencing and epistemic injustice in the context of the consultation processes with indigenous. Dina previously worked as a senior attorney at the Center for Environmental Rights in Cape Town. At the center, Dina represented a range of communities and activists in their battles for more transparent, accountable environmental and water management in the mining sector. She worked on the legal aspect of acid mine drainage, hydraulic fracturing, and was instrumental in the facilitation of a community activist network in the field of mining and environmental justice. Dina also led the center's work on improving transparency in environmental governance. And without further ado, we will now start our conversation. We have prepared some questions for the panelists, and we would like to start with a pre-recorded video from Eileen, one of our panelists who could not be here live today with us. So please, Joel, if you could play the video now.
Hi everyone, my name is Eileen Wakesho and I work with Nameti here in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm privileged to join today's conversation and I'll focus on securing women's customary land rights as a pathway towards addressing climate change in Kenya. By way of context, for those a little unfamiliar with Kenya, Kenya has 3 land tenure systems. And so we have public land, which is land that is set aside for public use, such as hospitals, roads, schools, name it. And then we have private land, which is land that is individually owned and people have absolute ownership. And then lastly, we have community land, which is land that has historically been owned and managed by indigenous and local communities. I'll focus today on community land and I'll tell you shortly why this is important. In Kenya, community lands, it's estimated that community land takes about 60% of all land in Kenya. Ideally, it's the biggest chunk of land in the country. It's land that supports millions of indigenous and local communities. These lands are mostly in arid and semi-arid areas. But even though you find a lot of these lands in arid and semi-arid areas, they are lands that are endowed with a lot of natural resources. And so companies, local elites, governments all want a piece of this land, making communities extremely vulnerable to lose their land. Loss of land for these communities is loss of, so much more than just land. It deprives Kenyans' most vulnerable citizens, especially women, ethnic minorities, the indigenous people, of a source of lives and livelihoods. We are seeing more and more mega infrastructure projects like the Lamu Port South Sudan Transport Corridor. We've also seen the recent discovery of oil and minerals that have since accelerated the rate at which community land is allocated to private investors, to governments, without free, prior, and informed consent of these communities. The land where these indigenous and local communities live is so much more than just land. It's about their identity, it's their heritage, and for some, it has such deep spiritual connection. And so it goes beyond just land as an asset for production. In 2016, the Kenyan government enacted for the first time a comprehensive law that provides for registration, for recognition first of these community lands, and then provides a framework for registration of the same. Community Land Act is a progressive legislation that provides strongly for aspects of inclusivity for both women and men in ownership of these lands, but also in the governance of these lands. The Community Land Act empowers communities to make rules and regulations on how their lands will be managed and administered. And this is one of the requirements before they go through the registration process. It's through the drafting of the bylaws that communities get time to be able to set out specific mechanisms of ensuring, critical aspects such as participation, who participates, how do they participate, besides participation, they also get a chance to be able to clearly state how to sustainably use their land and natural resources. They also talk about aspects around transparency and accountability that are so critical to land governance and to participation in key decision-making processes. You know, before the enactment of the Community Land Act, we had sort of a previous law that was since repealed, or that has since been repealed by the Community Land Act. This law is what governed the group ranches. The group ranches were, you know, gave a chance for communities to be able to register as groups and somehow manage their lands collectively. But then there were a lot of ills with the group ranches and how they were managed. For instance, we never had women as members in those communities, in those group ranches. In rare occasions where you found women, they were either widowed or they were, you know, unmarried daughters. But now for the Community Land Act, the provision for inclusivity means that women are supposed to be registered as members of those communities. And so women are supposed to be in the community land registers, which is a place that defines all other processes in terms of participation and decision making. For you to be able to inform and participate in all decision making processes, you've got to be a member of that community. And so the Community Land Act provides and gives us space for women to be members and equal members in the community. Besides just membership, it provides you know, space for women to participate in governance in the local land governance structures. And for Community Land Act, the local land governance structures we're talking about is the community land management committees. These are committees that are responsible for day-to-day management of affairs of this land. So such a huge shift from a time where women were not members, even though they existed, they never participated in governance structures, to a time that we're seeing now women become members because of this law, and then also women get a chance to be able to inform key decision-making processes in the. You know, the process of developing bylaws is such a powerful and a critical process for these communities. For many of these communities, the formal law, the constitution, and all other laws are very distant. They are laws that they never get a chance to interact with extensively. But when you talk about community land, when we talk about these community bylaws, they are laws that they set themselves and draft and agree. And so to them, law is that which lives with them. And because these are laws that they themselves have defined, they have sort of an obligation to be able to abide by these laws, because they are their own laws. They have set these laws. And you see, the most interesting thing is, even as they draft these bylaws on how they want to see their land managed, they are fulfilling a requirement in law. For them to be able to go through the registration process and have their customary and indigenous lands registered, they have to draft their bylaws. You know, as they're doing so, women have a chance to be able to define and contribute to how they want to see their land governed for the benefits of themselves as women, but also for the benefits of the larger community that they come from. You know, as they're pulling together these laws, they get a chance to be able to define how grazing lands or grazing zones will be accessed by who at what time. All these are so important because women do participate and have a role in grazing among these communities. They also get a chance to be able to define access of water points. You know, water is such a critical resource for women at household level, but also for their animals. And so as they sit together, they also clearly spell out how to access these water points, at what point, how do they manage, how do they regulate access, and so on and so forth. Such critical processes for women and for their communities. They also decide how they would allow other communities to be able to access their grazing zones for purposes of reciprocity, because these are pastoral communities. And so their animals will definitely move to other communities, and other communities' animals will also access their grazing zones. So they agree the mechanisms for purposes of peaceful coexistence, and this is defined and put together in the community bylaws. You know, besides just, you know, how to be able to access grazing zones, water points, they also agree on how to, you know, address conflicts that arise, how to mutually negotiate in dialogue with key actors in case of conflict, whether conflict touches on issues of grazing or on water resources. Tito, such an incredible woman in you know, from Kipsing. Kipsing is in Isiolo in Kenya. And Matito does not have any formal education, but that has never been a limitation to her. Once the law was passed, and with a clear provision that women must be in the Community Land Management Committee, Matito offered herself to be a member of the Community Land Management Committee. The Land Management Committee is a very critical land governance structure in these communities, as I mentioned before. And so Matito joined and offered her candidature to be part of the Community Land Management Committees. These committees are appointed. And so shifting from a place where these committees were purely male-dominated to a place that now, because of this particular law, that women like Matito have a space to be able to sit in this decision-making, in this governance structure and inform decision-making processes. And so despite Matito despite the fact that Matito has never gone through any formal education, Matito's wealth of knowledge in traditional methods of climate adaptation and resilience is unmatched. Through the Community Land Act and through the platform that is offered by the Community Land Act, which is the Community Land Management Committee, Matito is able to share her knowledge of this traditional knowledge on how to best mitigate the impacts of climate change with the community, and, you know, ensure that this is captured within the bylaws and used by the community. If you speak to Matito today, she's able to show you some of those laws that she proposed, using her knowledge of how they used to address, using her traditional knowledge of how they used to address climate change then. And that law has now been adopted as part of the bylaws that are governing this community in Kipsing. You know, besides the act, the Community Land Act, women like Matito have a chance to be able to participate because of the paralegals, the barefoot lawyers that have worked with communities like Matito's community to, one, just help them understand what this law means in the language that Matito understands, which is Samburu. In such basic ways, these paralegals are not trained lawyers, but they have some basic knowledge and training on the law. And so they've supported Matito and other women to be able to understand the law. They've supported Matito and other community and other women to be able to slowly break the barriers of women being able to articulate their contributions in communities. And more we're seeing women being able to participate in decision-making processes and influencing them for the benefit of the larger community. You know, Matito's story is a powerful reflection of what it looks like when the law is placed in the hands of ordinary people like Matito. It's so powerful because what Matito needed is just to be able to really know and understand this law and use it to support herself, her family, other women, and the community. There's so much power once you place law in the hands of ordinary women like Matito to be able to secure their tenure rights and to be able to ensure that we face this monster that's climate change. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So now our panelists can turn on like their cameras and their mics. We will start our conversation. And the first question that I have today is what are some key climate change related challenges that particularly affect women and girls empowerment that you would like to highlight or that your organization has worked on? So maybe Rebecca, you could start us off.
Sure. Hi, and first, thank you so much for having me join this panel. And I apologize. I'm going to leave my video off because I'm traveling in Nigeria tonight. The internet connection is not stable. So my apologies for not sharing my screen. I just want to start off where my colleague Eileen left off, which is to say that for us, access to justice for to be because of the climate, and we know that the way that women understand land use can be different than men. Another example of that, to build off of what Eileen was talking about, is also about what happens when that land comes under threat.
Rebecca, are you there? You're kind of breaking up. I think we can maybe continue. Maybe Alison, you could jump in and tell us a little bit about these challenges, and Rebecca can then come back whenever she's able to.
Sure. What we work on at Nixon Peabody, which is a larger law firm, we try to focus on the women empowerment issues of this, and focusing really on how are we mitigating, responding to climate change. And we look into the underrepresentation of women in these emerging industries that are responding to climate change, especially in like the community solar, renewable energy space. Often women continue to be the vast minority. And so we continue to go into that and really help to give them a voice and find them sponsors and mentors. One of the initiatives we're part of is Warriors for Sustainable Economy, where we commit $2 million to pro bono services every 2 years to helping out like startups and nonprofits in this fight against the monster of climate change. Eileen definitely was right on with her descriptions. So there we try to look for organizations that are both nonprofits and startups that are women owned or women initiated, and help to give them that extra startup by giving them connections to accountants, connections to lawyers, and really fitting them up. Some successes we've had is Sustainable Ocean Alliance, which is an incubator for ocean-related solutions for climate change. They've accelerated and helped now 45 ocean-related startups, empowered 5,000 leaders in 165 countries. They provide 175 plus micro grants now in 65 different countries to help out with these like ocean-related solutions to climate change. And again, that is a woman-founded, Daniela Fernandez. She's amazing. She had a concept in 19 for this incubator that is now taken off, as I said, 165 countries. It's just amazing. Another one on the for-profit side we helped with was Kinetic Communities Consulting. And that idea there by that founder, Daphne Rose, again, a woman, Hispanic as well, and 100% female owned, was to create community solar and bring that community solar aspect to affordable housing. So she's in New York City and has been initiating this. We've been helping her with all the transactional documents on that side of it. So we're trying very hard on that women empowerment angle of it to try and focus on ways to both mitigate and then also to react to, respond to this monster of climate change.
Okay, great. Dina, is there anything you would like to add here?
Maybe I think a lot of my work focuses on consultation and participation and the extent to which marginalized communities, including women, not only women, do or don't get to have their say in regard to certain kind of modes of environmental and climate change decision making. And one thing that's quite a clear impact in the climate change decision making realm, at least in the Southern African countries that I sort of mostly work in and on, is that in regard to all environmental decision making, all too often affected communities and women in those communities are not consulted at all, or they're consulted in a way that is kind of box ticking at best. So they're brought in to be part of a conversation at a point when all the kind of key decisions are mostly taken. And we see a kind of even more extreme version of that in the climate change space, partially because it is such a global problem, partially because a lot of the funding is coming from outside of the country. So what we're seeing happen is a decision is being made in the international space or by a funder sitting in Norway, for example. They allocate money for a project they want to see happen in Zimbabwe or South Africa or you know, somewhere in Southern Africa, and the money is allocated, the NGOs are appointed, the expertise are put in place, and it's only after all of that has already happened that the local affected, rural, often women, are brought into the conversation. And at that point, they're not going to redesign any kind of program around what these women say. So even though the program is meant to benefit these women, it's meant to be a climate information program in their interests, you know, it may not be what they want, it may not be well suited to them, but by the time anyone's asking them, it's sort of far too late. And so they kind of get all these opportunities to say something, but what they say kind of doesn't matter, doesn't get to have any meaningful decision-making impact. So that's just what I would add.
Okay, great. And like on that note, Dina, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the challenges that NGOs in particular face when fighting climate injustice that you have encountered in your work, and how these challenges affect women and girls in particular.
I mean, maybe I should start by just highlighting the fact that I do not currently work for an NGO. I work for a university. I have worked for NGOs. I've done a lot of time doing research on NGOs. And I should say I've landed in quite an NGO skeptical place. And so I ask everyone to just take that sort of with a pinch of salt. I think one of the problems or one of the challenges that NGOs face, that NGOs I've worked for have faced, and that NGOs I've studied have faced, is that they kind of often end up being in the middle between the people with the money and the people who need the money. And I think that can be a very problematic dynamic, and I think that can be a problematic place to be. So something that I think is challenging, and again, it's related to what I was saying earlier about these decisions being taken kind of at an international level or outside of the space where the impact is felt. Often communities and women and girls in particular are seen kind of merely as beneficiaries of climate change programs, who sort of essentially should be kind of grateful for the services that are rolled out to them. And so they are really, sort of, it gets better, but there are often programs where women and girls especially are not treated as the kind of experts, as the sort of epistemic agents that they ought to be treated as. And that I think is kind of what is wonderful about the presentation we heard, was it was about putting lawmaking into the hands of the women in these communities. And so I think kind of often what happens is that NGOs sort of get identified as the sort of source of expertise, and those expertise are then sort of brought into the affected community. They're sort of providing the services to those communities, as opposed to seeing the kind of extraordinary expertise that is there and the contribution that is in those communities already. And I think connected to that is the risk that often NGOs sort of talk over and for the communities they want to represent and help, rather than just sort of ensuring that there's a space for those people to sort of speak, to have their own voices. And I think all of these problems are just kind of common problems in the NGO sector, but I think they're particularly they are particularly prominent in the climate change sector for two reasons. One, I've already mentioned, because often these things are being decided and funded from abroad. But the other reason is because climate change is articulated as a technical and scientific problem, as a global problem. And because it's sort of seen in these ways, the kind of the knowledge and expertise of women in particular, rural women kind of even more so, girls maybe again even more so, is not sort of recognized as being in the same place as, you know, the sort of scientific knowledge that's often given higher priority.
Yeah. Yeah. Rebecca, are you back with us? We can't hear you.
No, you can't hear me now?
Oh, yeah, we do now.
Oh,
okay. Great. So I wanted to ask you the same question I just asked Tina, but focused on land and environmental warriors and defenders. Like, what challenges have you encountered in your work that they, like environmental and land warriors and defenders particularly, face while fighting climate injustices, and how these challenges affect women and girls in particular? Are you there?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay. We'll try one more time. We see accessing the law as key to being able to defend the climate when you think about land and resources that women use. But accessing the law can be really far from a lot of women and girls. An example I think of when I think about the power of having the law is this mayor, this female mayor I knew from Hoima, Uganda. Hoima is this town in Uganda close to where there's a lot of oil production, or trying to have lots of oil production. And she really wanted to protect the land in her community. In that area, it is customary at big meetings for government officials to give long speeches. And it is customary for the other government officials to sit and read their phones while one of them is giving a speech. And I noticed at one of these meetings that instead of reading her phone, she was reading laws underneath the desk. And she said to me afterwards that, you know, if I know these provisions in the laws, they will listen to me. The company will listen to me, and the government will listen to me in a different way. Feeling that difference of the access to the women who are in a more rural community, like what Eileen was talking about, and the distance between what the knowledge of that really formal system and the power that we know as lawyers can be in there is often really far for the communities. And so needing a bridge between the power of that law and the power that already exists within the community to be able to access that. And then the other big challenge that we're seeing for women trying to engage in these conversations are security and protection issues. So it is really dangerous to be trying to protect land in a lot of places, because it goes counter to a lot of other enterprises, right? Of people trying to build things, corporate engagements about government wanting to make certain changes. And in a lot of places that can be really risky. Both physically risky and risky in other ways. And women, particularly, to stand up against these things in their community can be really, really even more tricky for women and girls in different ways than it can be for men. Because when especially when communities are divided around issues about how and whether to protect their land, it can issues about masking and how that can amplify within a community and create even more discord. Speaking out about that, about your view on that, can be risky. And that's even more so true in a community that is facing a big change and trying to challenge that change. And for women, particularly in more patriarchal societies, for women to spouse can be really risky in both personal and then public ways. And so that's another big challenge we're seeing.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rebecca. So now, Maria Antonia, based on your experience, what do you see are the most effective ways that pro bono or volunteer lawyers can engage with these efforts? And how does climate litigation interplay with pro bono work and gender equality?
Thank you, Natalia. I did work prior to what I'm doing now. Just now, my work focuses on global climate litigation. So I can give you some examples of that. But before I worked here, I did work for the Van Center, which is an organization that provides pro bono legal services to NGOs around the world. And I think that provides a unique opportunity to sort of see what the legal needs are in NGOs across the world, and specifically, obviously, being a woman, that was always you know, a particular focus of mine, to try to understand that gender balance and how that applies. So it was actually really interesting to see how the pro bono lawyers who were usually more engaged in the projects that they accepted were actually women. Not that the men weren't great, there were some great ones, but we did see that a lot. And because, you know, since in the US, law firms are required to do pro bono, a lot of the times they take those projects, but they don't really engage in them. But we did see a lot of really, you know, engaging women on these projects around the world, and some were really big projects, you know, with NGOs that have big names and that will look good, but some of the NGOs were actually really small, and they often face the same challenges. And I think, obviously, you know, women face so many challenges as is, that running an NGO and being a woman is often even harder than you know, than with all the responsibilities that women have at home and so forth. And I think, especially, I'm from Latin America, so I see that a lot in terms of how, you know, women are very underrepresented and in the political circles. So it's even harder to actually get their voices heard, and, you know, to ensure that there's some representation. But I think sort of the flip side of that is that we're seeing a lot of movement from women activists in climate change, and a lot of them, you know, young women, girls, who are actually using their voices and using social media to expand, you know, the reach of their, you know, what they're defending, you know, or inducing more climate action. And I think that is being represented in the climate litigation cases that we're seeing from youth plaintiffs. A lot of the youth petitions that we're seeing come mostly from young girls. There's obviously a mix in them, but another interesting case that I wanted to mention, that I think it's really, you know, provides sort of a cool, unique perspective, is the grandmother's case in Switzerland. You know, there's really grandmothers who, obviously women, who decided to come together to question, you know, the climate policies, and the case is now with the European Court of Human Rights. So, you know, that also, I think, provides sort of a unique angle to see here, and sort of a positive view of how women are taking matters into their own hands.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And now, turning to the private sector, Alison, could you maybe talk a little bit more about how do you think the private sector can help address climate-related challenges to achieve sustainability and gender equality?
Of course, thank you, Natalia. I think we're hearing a theme here, really, that women are definitely underrepresented in each of these, the NGOs, environmental warriors, litigation. And I think that comes back to the private sector as well. It's just making sure that women's voices get heard. Dina actually said a great phrase there: women are often seen but not heard. And I think that's important in every aspect, depending on wherever you fall into this. I'm hoping we are all doing our own thing to combat climate change on a small scale, if not a large scale, within our businesses. And I hope that each of us are making sure those women's voices are heard and are at the table. And if there are, you know, if you're looking at a selection of who to fund or which business to go with, even like which, hopefully put solar in your own home, which company to go with. Each time you do something like that, look for those women-owned businesses. And if there's nobody there, that's the question you should be asking and having this conversation of why there are no women-owned businesses here and how can you help promote them? And I think that is it. For me, it's every single step of that private sector should be asking everything. Make sure there's women lawyers when they're litigating them, that are representing them, attorneys at the table, that the bankers that they're going with are not only climate friendly and thinking about sustainability and making sure they're positive, but also have the women bankers behind them if possible. And I think only going through every single effort like that and asking those questions every step is where it's really needs some change here to make sure women are really empowered and heard.
We also know that efforts to engage with women's human rights advocacy and lawyering raise a host of issues involving cultural awareness or sensitivity in dealing with trauma or even backlash from surrounding communities. So I wanted to ask you, Dina, how have you handled such issues when you or your organization has encountered them, and what steps can volunteer lawyers do or take to address these issues?
Thanks, Natalia. I think that the truth is that in my kind of personal experience, I haven't handled these issues as well as I probably could have or should have. And I think that's, I think that sort of two things. As lawyers, we sometimes think we can fix everything, and that there is no problem we can't solve. And in fact, there are in sort of all over the world remarkable resources available and people sort of working on issues related to sort of cultural and emotional and mental trauma. And there's also that lawyers should be collaborating with. Lawyers are not, they're not sort of equipped or trained to sort of deal with all the aspects of what happens and goes on with communities, or with the kinds of anxieties and hardships that the environmental defenders that they may want to kind of support and be there for are experiencing and going through. I'm a very big proponent of horizontal engagement. So kind of instead of creating systems in which, you sort of come in from above, or in which all the dynamics of engagement are happening vertically, in which you create systems at a horizontal level, in which there are kind of networks within communities, between communities and within communities, in which you kind of support and facilitate community-led programs and activities. And so that was kind of a big part of our work when we were trying to sort of, I think some of the most successful work we did was when we worked ourselves out of a job, when there was systems in place that no longer needed us, where there were paralegals in the community, where there were support systems in the community. But the other thing I think, as I was sort of thinking about this question, because, I was working in these spaces as a woman. I mean, my identity as a woman is a bit complicated, but I was working in these spaces as a woman. But something that I think I kind of wasn't sufficiently aware of when I went into it and became very sort of apparent to me is that what it is to be a woman doesn't mean the same thing across kind of all the versions of us, and we're all kind of familiar with intersectionality at this point, but I think it's an idea that often gets misunderstood as the kind of intersection of a whole lot of experiences of oppression or racism. But in fact, what intersectionality is about is that I would walk into a room as a white woman lawyer with my client who was a Black woman farmer, and what it meant to be a woman for me, for the white men we were talking to, was very different to how they understood her as a woman. And recognizing that being a woman meant radically different things for each of us, it was very important to me to recognize that although that experience was in kind of different ways traumatic for both of us, you know, that trauma doesn't necessarily translate. We aren't always just women in the room. We are the women we are. And I think that makes the kind of knowing when to sort of step back and not try and fix the cultural trauma side of things is important, especially if your job is to do the, you know, the paperwork and get it to court. And anyway, sorry, I don't know if that was very articulate, but
very helpful. Yeah. So maybe Rebecca, do you have something to add in this regard?
Dina, I think that was a really, really helpful intervention, Dina. So thank you. I would just say there's a lot of pressure in a lot of the communities that we work with. So as a world, we need to build a lot of stuff really fast, right, to address climate change. And so if you imagine a big wind park, for example, that might seem like a good idea overall, but individuals within that community and different women in that community can be really different from each other. And so as a lawyer coming in to listen to a community responding to something like that, it's just really important to have space for those different viewpoints, I think, and to have the community be in charge of being able to make a decision, and understanding that it might be hard to have full consensus, but at least having space for those different viewpoints. I think the other thing to just overall be aware of, right, is, and I think lawyers always know this from their clients, that the facts that are most important to a client aren't always the facts that are most important to the case, right? And particularly though, in environmental justice, working with women who may not have been heard very much and their issue hasn't been heard, understanding it from their perspective and having that be heard is as important to them as getting the facts into the specific case, into the case format. And so making sure in your volunteer process to have room to hear their story and to recognize the full parts of that, in addition to the facts that are most relevant to the filing you're doing. And the last bit I'll hear that we're on the front lines of environmental justice. And there are a lot of day-to-day stressors, particularly even more so during COVID, when people have been more separated from their support systems and from physically interacting with others. And I think that while it's not, Dina mentioned, not necessarily the role of a volunteer lawyer to fix that problem, it is an opportunity to be aware of it and to connect to resources if it makes sense, but also just to know that you know, there's a lot else going on, I guess, in someone's life than the issue that you're representing them on. And so having flexibility with that. And you know, we often find that sometimes that means communities or individual women need to step back from a fight that we think is really important, or they in principle think is really important, but stepping back allows them the space to be able to do it. And unfortunately, in a lot of legal systems, that can be tricky, right? There's pressures within making filings on certain timelines, but we think it's important to have them feel empowered enough to be able to make those choices.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Alison, are there any other interventions to gender inequality that you believe would be effective in addressing these issues that, for example, would be helpful for pro bono lawyers to understand? I mean, is there like greater need for advocacy or social service interventions that can make lawyers more effective in your area of work?
Sure, Natalia. I think as Rebecca just said, like giving space in that room to really have every point of view heard is what I think is the next point. Just this week, SEC announced we're now going to require ESG disclosures, environmental social governance disclosures for all public corporations. And I think as that guidance gets rolled out and that guidance gets in place, which is already in place with the EU, we're going to see basically all public companies giving some sort of this environmental social governance descriptions. And that right there is that perfect intersection between environmental, that E, and then the social, you get the D, the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion piece of that in there. And it's a great opportunity to really focus on every public company you interact with and look into what are they doing in this intersection between climate change and gender equality. And asking the questions, I think, and having those uncomfortable conversations that if they don't have an answer to that, that conversation is important right there in that place. If you're asking the questions and they can't answer, then hopefully that goes back and they go to somewhere else in their management and you get more answers. And I think if you focus on this and getting those voices heard and giving that space, that's a way to really do it, is to ask those questions and have those conversations at every step. So.
Yeah, great. Maria Antonia, do you have anything to add?
Hi, sorry, hopefully you can hear me because okay, because I have to, well, as a woman, I have to go home, and I was in the office today for the first time in a long time, and I have to now head home to get my kids from their nanny. So I have to turn off the video and continue. But, I think overall there has been really, really exciting points made here. I don't think I have too much to add to this particular point, but I really like how we're reinforcing sort of the same challenges and aspects here.
Yeah, I agree. Some very interesting cross-cutting arguments, issues have been raised. So finally, I have a question for all panelists, like whoever wants to answer, it's welcome to. So has COVID-19 presented additional challenges to the work of NGOs or environmental defenders or whatever is your area of work that you have identified? And if so, how COVID-19 has affected women and girls' empowerment and participation in decision-making spaces regarding climate injustice? Whoever wants.
I can start. I mean, I think just looking at this panel here between us, like across the country, is just showing you something that's really possible as a benefit of COVID-19. That's we're all working from home. Maria Antonia can go and relieve the nanny. We can have Rebecca across the world. We have the video of Eileen. Having us all here together is so like inspiring and just amazing to have these conversations. I think were not really possible before the pandemic. That really showed all of us that we still can't do it all. I think we all try to do that as women. That's definitely not possible, but at least the conversations are able to happen where before we would have been in person. And I think about climate change, like the greenhouse gas emissions, that would have been included in that, to us all be in the same room together. Instead, I think this conversation can be just as powerful, even though they are still in 2D. So.
I really like your response, Allison, because I often think about this from that side as well. I had a very unique, sorry, I'm heading to my car, so it's a little noisy, but I had a very unique, I think, experience related to COVID because I had a young child, but I was pregnant, so I had to be on bed rest with my second. It was very unfortunate, but what happened with respect to all of that is that I had to hire a nanny, which I didn't have before. And that really provided me with a lot of time actually to work on a bunch of projects all over the world that I often wouldn't really have the opportunity to do. And I completely understand how that comes from a lot of privilege because I could do that. Before my son used to go to daycare, we had to obviously take him out when COVID started. But I think, you know, that that aspect of actually opening up a whole world is very significant. And I think I was very fortunate to have a lot of additional opportunities that I wouldn't have because I couldn't, you know, travel away from my kids, or even for sort of financial aspects too. I was doing my PhD, so I couldn't like pay for all those conferences and the trips, and now it's all online. So it's much easier to actually engage in a lot of the discussions that are happening on a global level. So, you know, obviously COVID really reinforced the need for childcare and how we're all very reliant on that, and how women really get the brunt of it. Because, you know, for me, you know, it's the same as I think in most families, that my husband still had that big job that had to take most of the time. And if we had extra responsibilities with the kids, it was usually the women who had to do that. And that obviously affected things. And my PhD was supposed to take 3 years, took 5. So these things happen. But at the same time, it did sort of open up that that whole world in terms of those sort of global discussions.
Yeah.
I really I've really enjoyed how positive both Alison and Maria Antonia's responses to this question have been. And so I kind of want to say something that keeps in that spirit, but then maybe I'll also say something a bit sadder. But I think one of the things that has been kind of remarkable about the pandemic, as far as sort of women's organizations are concerned and environmental defenders are concerned, was just watching the kind of incredible agility and speed with which those community organizers snapped into the role of providing a whole new array of services to the communities that they work for and with, you know. So people went from being environmental advocates to running soup kitchens. They went from, you know, I have friends and colleagues who have been sort of community networkers, or kind of have really worked on mining and extraction issues, and sort of overnight they were able to sort of pull together incredible resources within their own communities to support people who needed to just kind of go into total isolation, or who couldn't kind of get water, or who were sick. And it was just amazing to see that, you know, I mean, obviously those are all very transferable skills, but it was just amazing to see that, you know, when you are a community defender, you're a community defender, you know, almost no matter what the threat is. And so I think that's kind of been amazing, is just to see the sort of resilience and work that's happened in this period by women particularly. But I think it's also, you know, it's been it's just been a period of terrible loss, and so many in our community didn't survive the pandemic. They were, you know, and that's, yeah, and that's affected old people, and it's affected women, and yeah, so the kind of impact of the pandemic has just been huge and substantial, and I think we will be measuring it for a generation.
Yeah, that's right. Rebecca, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think I would just jump into that in saying, I agree that there's been more opportunity challenges we've seen during the pandemic has been, well, in a lot of places where there are consultation requirements, completely fell off during COVID. Governments said that they didn't need to happen, and the projects continued. So a lot of new extraction projects in particular were allowed to move forward with no consultations from the community then. And COVID was often used as a shield against communities consultation. Of that, women even more so than, and so it has been a tricky thing. I think the other tricky thing globally, and we saw this at the last COP, is that the world's been a little distracted for the last 2 years. And it's been a big global problem, so that makes sense on some regard, but the scale and impact of climate change is still as threatening as it was, even more so now. And the energy to organize globally to respond to that seems to have dropped. And so that means something that we as a, and I think there's particularly some really interesting space for women to step into that role. Reality of the pandemic is how to still have the energy to rally around it. Yeah, right. So is there anything any of you would like to add as we're coming to an end in our discussion?
I think that aspect on the public participation, it's gonna take a long time until we're sort of back on track on that. It really affected people all over the world in multiple levels that I think we don't quite really understand fully yet. So that's a very good point.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, just to add to that, it wasn't just that consultation didn't happen on projects that were ongoing that needed to happen. People took advantage of the situation to create entire new programs, development plans. Legislation was brought in that wasn't on the agenda at all because it was literally an opportunity to do it without consultation. So this pandemic has kind of profited, as we already know, it's profited, it's sort of been hugely damaging for most people and incredibly profitable for some.
Okay, so maybe we can now go to questions from the audience. Do we have?
Yeah, we have one question that is directed to Dina. The first question was directed to Dina, and it was from something you mentioned early on. The question is, how can funders, as you described, become more sensitive to the grassroots needs and interests and consult with them first, rather than do a top-down imposition of project form? And how can women and girls move to become power experts for such funders?
I have a lot of maybe far too radical opinions about this, but I'm just gonna drop them anyway. I mean, my feeling is that the whole funding model, the sort of project funding model, is very problematic. I think that communities should just be given money and be allowed to decide how to spend it themselves. Basically, if you want to empower a community, you don't plan their empowerment. So that's probably my most sort of out there view on this, is that we should just funnel money straight to the communities who need it. But I think that maybe, I sort of believe in consultation and the importance of it, but I think there's a problem with thinking about consultation and participation and the way it locates people in relation to an activity. So it allocates some people as kind of decision makers and policy makers and sort of financiers, and other people as sort of interested parties. And I think that there are kind of a couple of things that one can do. one thing is you can go into the community and hire experts. These are the experts. If you want to work in that area, go and pay the people who with the expertise to tell you what they know about it. That's not about consultation. That's about hiring the relevant experts. And what your experts might tell you is that the project you want to do is not appropriate at all. And then you've got to listen to your experts and pay them for the information that they've given you. And I think that we're just very used to doing that with white professionals, and very not used to doing that with like women in rural areas who usually have the actual expertise. So that would be one suggestion I would have. But as I say, I have lots of strong and impractical views about this. I'll be happy to share some other time.
Thank you. Allison or Rebecca or Maria Antonio, did you have anything you wanted to follow up on that? If not, Allison,
I'll follow up on that as asking the next question from Nancy in the chat too. Dina, how do we get the money to those people and get those experts empowered? Do you have any suggestions on the actual practical ways to do that?
I mean, I'm a big believer in a basic wage. I think like we should just be paying everyone money. But I think that often funders are kind of concern driven. So for example, we were approached by a funder at one point who kind of had heard about a particular community who was vulnerable to uranium exposure, and they're sort of worried about what to do about this community, and so they funded lawyers to get involved. If you've identified the community, just give them the money. There are not necessarily systems in place. The community may spend it well or badly, but I just don't think that sort of external funder NGO systems have really worked either. And I think there's a tendency to treat communities like they don't know what's best for them. And I think it's very possible that communities will then prioritize spending on their immediate short-term needs rather than on kind of long-term energy and climate change programs. And I think that might be completely appropriate. But as I say, this isn't, I recognize the kind of impracticalities of this and the kind of extreme long-term indebted situations of poverty in communities that mean that just injecting money can sometimes make things significantly worse rather than better. But I have opinions about all of those things, but I don't think that that's what this forum is for. But I do think that there's a lot of leaks in the pipe. So I think there are people with money who want that money to go where it's needed. And I think between them and the people who need the money, a lot of money vanishes in ways that it kind of shouldn't. And maybe if we cut out a big chunk of the pipe, we could come up with something more effective.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that participatory grant making is really important, and something that hopefully we're going to be coming to more in the coming months and ages. So I wanted to ask another question from Nancy Newman in the chat. It says, I wanted also to thank Heather Oxman for that previous question. She said that she was happy to hear your strong and impractical views, Dina. So thank you for that. So Nancy asks, what is one concrete thing that you suggest each of to try to do to advance women's leadership on climate change? Allison, you're unmuted. You want to start?
Sure. I feel like I'd probably just say, as I said before, like just really ask the questions and making sure you ask questions all the time about where are the women, where are their voices, and making sure they're actually being heard and are present. And I think I actually love Dina's thinking about what probably trying to solve and then really trying to figure out how to get there. But I think even this conversation today is just so interesting. I think you, as IANGEL, has provided all these documentation about ways to really combat climate change for women. and the underrepresentation of women and this issue. And I feel like I've seen so little on this. I haven't seen a similar panel to what you guys are doing today. So I really want to commend you for that in the first place. And I think having these conversations and continuing to have them is something that's a practical thing we can do, and making sure we have them, with our families, with our clients, our customers, our colleagues, our bosses, and the ones we're mentoring from the ground up, and making sure that everybody's really having these conversations and thinking about these connections between climate change and gender inequity. I think there is so much there, and people are not talking about it. So using every connection you have, social media, to bring this conversation to the forefront. And so I really commend all of you here at IANGEL for having the conversation today.
Go ahead, Dina.
I mean, first, I'd like to agree with Alison. I think something that we haven't spoken about today, we've spoken a lot about kind of making sure women get to speak, but the thing we haven't spoken enough about is making sure that we train the people who are meant to hear them. We have a lot of bad listeners in our kind of decision-making structures. And I think, and I know that doesn't sound concrete, but I think they're very concrete ways that we can make sure that women are heard when they speak, and that what they actually say is actually heard and then actually taken into account. And one of the things I think we need to build into our consultation processes that I think isn't there enough is a call and response system. So in which women speak, and then whoever's meant to be hearing them has to report, has to say back what they've heard and what they've understood of it and what they've done with it. There needs to be much more reporting back to women, because I think something that happens a lot with rural women is that there'll be a consultation and they'll get to speak, and women are speaking all the time, they're making their voices heard. But then, like nothing happens, or next thing there's a mine there, or there's a climate change project, or there's, and just kind of requiring hearers to hear, requiring listeners to do more work and to account for what they've heard and to report back what they've heard and to make sure that women agree with what is, and to know how their knowledge and information is being used. I think these are all really important structures that will radically slow down consultation, that will make it kind of more expensive and tedious, but that are very kind of practical and concrete, and also shift our attention to the extent to which women are speaking and not being listened to at the same time.
I totally agree. And I want to recognize that there is a question raised about working with people with mental health and HIV issues, and how to bring awareness of these issues to the legal communities on a worldwide basis. I think this is not quite on point with the climate justice, but we are working with people with intersectional identities, and I don't know if any of you want to weigh in on that. Okay, there's another question that I will read from Walter Kiza. And the question is, what do you do in a situation where land wranglers don't want dialogue, especially where the victims are widows, and the widows don't want to be helped simply because when the activists leave, the men attack them? This is from Walter, who's in northern Uganda. Anybody want to address that?
I mean, I think to some extent, this is one of the issues that Natalia was getting at in her question about kind of trauma and the sort of risks involved in doing this kind of work. And I think that it's a sort of very difficult thing, but I think that, that it's a very crucial part of all the kind of volunteer lawyers that I know, it's a very sort of crucial part of their work and sense of themselves to sort of not want to make situations worse, to not put people in more kind of vulnerable or dangerous situations. And we try and do that in lots of ways. We try and work with people who ask us for help. We don't just sort of impose our help on people. And we also come up with lots of creative ways to talk to people in ways that protects their safety, that protects their identities, and that sort of makes sure that defenders are not kind of rendered more subject to violence or danger than they would be without our presence there. It's something you navigate very carefully in every single case. But it's often very important to kind of be asked in, you know, to be sort of welcomed in, rather than to sort of arrive as some kind of savior into a community where maybe you're not wanted by people who maybe don't want you there.
Yeah, I think Rebecca may be having issues unmuting or speaking, so I just want to read, she dropped an answer in the chat saying, we have seen that there are a lot of different reasons why a woman may choose not to move forward with a case. As Dina mentioned, we think it's important to listen to the individual. We also think it's important to build knowledge about the law amid a wider community so that individuals might have more support in an instance like that. Absolutely. Okay, I have one more question, and I think this will be the last question from Nancy Butler. I hear a lot that the solution for a lot of women's issues starts as a young child with education for boys and girls to understand how each should be treated and the rights each has or have. Would you agree? And if so, how do you think we can make this shift? I'm not sure what she's getting at there, but if any of you want, feel free to answer.
I'm going to guess, I think it's kind of getting what Dina said earlier, that even when the women have their voice being spoken, that they're not being heard. And how do we get them to be heard? And that gets to teaching the men and thus the boys who will be the men of the future to make sure they're listening and getting those voices in. So I agree, if that's the sentiment, I agree that it's really important to be teaching, especially our young men, how to listen.
I absolutely agree. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd say I think part of that, which I know that I've witnessed other women of my own mentors and coaches do, is just really listening to each other and then making sure that you really emphasize what the women in the room have said. So taking that moment to be silenced, but later on going, you know, well, Dina said this, and I want to make sure that we all, you know, thank you, Dina, so much for her thoughts earlier. And, you know, thanks for Rob for repeating them. Let's get back to what Dina said and making that those comments that maybe they might be a little uncomfortable or snippy, but it's making the point that the woman said it first. And I think that that's kind of even in every aspect of it, going back to that of like making sure they all heard and emphasize each other and support each other.
Yeah, being allies, teaching boys and girls to be allies and to listen to the smallest voice in the room.
And maybe also to add to what Alison said, which I think is really important, is so there was wonderful research done about kind of women in India, forest workers who found that they kind of were really struggling to be heard in decision-making spaces, in men's spaces. And so what they did is they created women's only spaces just to complain together about what it was like to try and be heard in these decision-making spaces. And it had this incredibly transformative effect when women could just be with other women and talk to other women and practice with other women and be heard by other women. It really changed the way they kind of started sort of talking in other spaces. Not that I'm saying that the work is for women to do here, that we need to change the way we talk, just that the sorts of spaces where women can sort of speak and support each other are kind of critically important, and sort of creating those and facilitating them and can be enormously valuable.
Totally agree.
I think a lot of that relates also to this. I'm sorry. Can I
Go ahead, Maria.
to this? I was gonna say this unconscious bias that I think some of us were raised in, and I think that's more relevant in some parts of the world more than others. Like in Latin America, I think it's very specific the way that, you know, women and men have different roles in society, and it's slow, obviously changed a lot, but I think it's still a very slow process. So I think maybe that's the piece of the education that's very relevant in the way that kids are raised to actually break those barriers and those stereotypes.
Absolutely. And I think having safe spaces for girls as they're being raised as well to build up their confidence is also really important all around the world, globally. So I think that brings us to an end for today. I want to thank all of our panelists. You all were amazing, and it's so fabulous to have feminist climate justice experts join us today. I really hope that we can keep this conversation going and move this issue forward, because the intersection of gender and climate justice is not going away. It's something that we need to keep paying attention to. And also thank you so much, Natalia, for moderating. It was great to have you here, and I'm so glad you're a member of the IANGEL board. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and you can find more information about IANGEL at iangel.org. And we hope to see you in person at next year's CSW. Take care, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.